Have you ever wondered what really drives a person to commit such horrifying crimes? How did one man elude capture while terrorizing a community for decades? Today, we're diving into one of the most notorious serial killer cases in American history, a case that shook the nation and left law enforcement baffled. The Green River Killer, as he came to be known, was responsible for the murders of dozens of women, mostly sex workers and runaways, in the late 80s and early 90s. But what made this case so significant wasn't just the sheer number of victims, but the way it challenged the way law enforcement approached investigations and dealt with the media. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Green River Killer case is the way it became a turning point in the development of forensic technology and investigative techniques. The case forced detectives to think outside the box, to consider new approaches and strategies that would ultimately change the way they worked. But before we get into all of that, let's take a step back and look at the impact this case had on the victims' families and the community as a whole. The Green River Killer case was a nightmare for the families of the victims, who were left with more questions than answers for years. They were forced to endure the uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones, and the frustration of watching the police struggle to make progress in the case. It was a painful and traumatic experience that would leave a lasting scar on those affected. As we delve deeper into this case, we'll explore the ways in which it changed law enforcement protocols and forever altered the way we think about serial killers. But for now, let's turn our attention to the challenges faced by investigators during the case. When the bodies of the first few victims were discovered, detectives were immediately faced with a daunting task: finding a killer who seemed to have left behind no evidence. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but a trail of death and destruction in his wake. As the body count continued to rise, so did the pressure on detectives to catch the killer. The media was having a field day, sensationalizing the case and putting even more heat on the police to solve it. It was a high-stakes game, with the lives of innocent women hanging in the balance. Despite the challenges, detectives refused to give up. They worked tirelessly, poring over evidence and following up on leads, no matter how small. They knew that the key to catching the killer lay in finding that one piece of evidence that would crack the case wide open. But as the months dragged on, the case began to take its toll on the detectives. As the investigation continued, detectives began to develop a profile of the killer. They knew he was a white male, probably in his 30s or 40s, and that he had a fascination with prostitutes. But despite their best efforts, detectives still couldn't seem to catch a break. The killer was always one step ahead, leaving behind just enough evidence to keep the police guessing, but not enough to actually identify him. That was until the night of November 30th, 2001, when Gary Ridgway was finally arrested for the murders of the Green River victims. It was a moment of triumph for the detectives, who had worked tirelessly for years to bring the killer to justice. Ridgway's early life and psychological profile reveal the complexity of his character. Born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, he grew up in SeaTac, Washington, in a troubled home. His mother was domineering, and his father, a bus driver, frequently complained about the presence of sex workers, perhaps planting the seeds of his later rage. Despite having a low IQ of around 80, Ridgway managed to graduate from a high school in 1969. He then joined the Navy, serving in Vietnam, where he saw combat. Upon returning, he took up a job painting trucks, a position he held for 30 years. When questioned about Ridgway after his arrest, friends and family described him as friendly but strange. His first two marriages resulted in divorce because of infidelities by both partners. His second wife, Marcia Winslow, claimed that he placed her into chokehold. He became religious during his second marriage, proselytizing door to door, reading the Bible aloud at work and at home, and insisting that his wife follow the strict teachings of their pastor. With Marcia, Gary had a son. Although he married 3 times and was fanatical about religion, Gary was frequent costumer of prostitutes. Ridgway's psychological profile was complex, to say the least. He was a classic case of a psychopath, with a complete lack of empathy for his victims. He was charming and charismatic, able to blend in with his surroundings and even convince his own father that he was innocent. But beneath the surface, Ridgway was seething with rage and resentment. He was driven by a deep-seated hatred for women, particularly prostitutes, whom he saw as a symbol of everything that was wrong with society. Ridgway's crimes were the manifestation of this twisted worldview. He preyed on vulnerable women, targeting those who were least likely to be missed. The victims were believed to be either sex workers or runaways, whom he picked up along Pacific Highway South. Ridgway would wrap his forearm around the front of their necks and use the other arm to pull back as tightly as he could, strangling them. He killed most victims in his home, his truck, or a secluded area. Most of their bodies were dumped in wooded areas around the Green River, Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, and other dump sites within South King County.
Your statement begins as follows. I killed the 48 women listed in the state's second amended information. I killed so many women, I have a hard time keeping them straight. I picked prostitutes as my victims because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without getting caught. Is that true?
Yes.
The first major sign of Ridgway's crimes emerged in July 1982, when the body of 16-year-old Wendy Caulfield was found floating in Seattle's Green River. Soon after, 4 more women were discovered in or near the river, all of them strangled. On August 15, 1982, police, including Detective David Reichert, responded to the discovery of 3 more bodies. They found 31-year-old Marcia Chapman and 17-year-old Cynthia Hines in the shallow water, with 16-year-old Opal Mills nearby in the undergrowth. All showed signs of violent deaths. In response, the King County Sheriff's Office formed the Green River Task Force on August 16, 1982, to investigate these killings. Despite their efforts, the murders continued, with more than 40 women found dead in the following 2 years, mostly around the Green River and the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport area. One case in the spring of 1983 involved 18-year-old Marie Malvar, who was last seen by her boyfriend getting into a pickup truck with a dark-haired man. Police questioned Ridgway about Marie's disappearance, but with no concrete evidence, they couldn't link him to the crime. By November 1983, Ridgway was questioned again about several other murders. He denied knowing any of the victims, and without evidence, authorities were unable to detain him. Ridgway later revealed in 2003 that during that 1983 interrogation, he had hidden scratches on his arm, left by Malvar, and later burned them with battery acid to cover his tracks. In 1986, the case was at a standstill, prompting the Green River Task Force to seek any help they could get. Convicted serial killer Ted Bundy offered his insights, suggesting that the killer might be revisiting the bodies of his victims. This idea was later confirmed by Ridgway. In 1987, Ridgway provided a saliva sample to the police, as he had been the last person seen with 2 of the victims. However, the forensic technology at the time wasn't advanced enough to link him to the murders, and Ridgway remained free. It wasn't until March 2001 that new DNA testing methods allowed investigators to re-examine evidence from the earlier cases. They were able to match DNA from 3 victims to the sample Ridgway had provided years earlier. This breakthrough finally connected him to the crimes and led to his capture, ending the long investigation into the Green River Killer. In late November 2001, nearly 2 decades after the terror began, King County Sheriff David Reichert stepped forward to deliver a long-awaited announcement. The Green River Killer had finally been caught. Ridgway was now linked to 4 of the early victims: Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen, whose body had been discovered back in 1983. The arrest marked a significant breakthrough in a case that had haunted the region for years. 2 years later, on November 5, 2003, Ridgway stood before the court to enter a plea that would forever seal his fate. In a deal that spared him from the death penalty, Ridgway confessed to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder.
Mr. Ridgway, is it your desire to plead guilty to the 48 charges of aggravated murder in the first degree because you believe that you are guilty of each of those offenses?
Yes.
Mr. Ridgway, I'm going to ask you at this time, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 1 for the death of Wendy Lee Caulfield?
Guilty.
Mr. Ridgway, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 2 for the death of Deborah Bonner?
Guilty.
Mr. Ridgway, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 3 for the death of Marcia Chapman?
Guilty.
How do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 4 for the death of Cynthia Hines?
Guilty.
How do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 5 for the death of Opal Mills?
Guilty.
On December 18, 2003, Ridgway faced his sentencing. In a King County courtroom, he was handed 48 life sentences to be served consecutively without any possibility of parole. The sentence ensured that Ridgway would spend the rest of his life in prison, paying for the lives he'd so mercilessly taken. But Ridgway's confessions didn't end there. On February 18, 2011, he pleaded guilty to a 49th murder, the 1982 killing of 20-year-old Rebecca Marrero. Although Ridgway had confessed to Marrero's murder during his 2003 plea deal, police had initially chosen not to charge him due to a lack of conclusive evidence. However, in December 2010, Marrero's remains were finally discovered just south of Seattle, leading to Ridgway's additional life sentence. Even years after his arrest, Ridgway's crimes continued to unfold. On December 19, 2023, the King County Sheriff's Office identified the remains of another of Ridgway's victims. Previously known only as Bones 17, DNA testing confirmed that the remains belonged to Lori Ann Razpotnik. Lori had run away from her home in Lewis County at age 15 in 1982 and was never seen again. Her remains had been found in Auburn, Washington in 1985, alongside those of another victim. Ridgway had told authorities in 2002 that he had placed 2 victims in the same area, and now, after decades, Lori Ann Razpotnik's identity was finally known. Investigators in Washington state have identified the last remaining set of human remains linked to the Green River Killer. These remains have now been confirmed as belonging to a woman who was determined to be a victim over 30 years ago, officials announced in January 2024. The partial remains of Tammy Lyles were discovered in King County in 2003. At the time, authorities were unable to confirm her identity and labeled the remains as Bones 20, according to a news release from the King County Sheriff's Office. In 2022, the Sheriff's Office collaborated with Texas-based forensic lab Othram to revisit the case. By the following year, the lab had developed a DNA profile that led to a preliminary identification of the remains as those of Tammy Lyles. To confirm this, detectives obtained a DNA sample from Lyles' mother, which provided a positive match. As we reflect on the Green River Killer case, It's clear that it was a watershed moment in American criminal history. It marked a shift in the way law enforcement approached investigations, from relying on traditional methods to embracing modern technologies and strategies. The case also raised important questions about the nature of evil and what drives people to commit such heinous crimes. It forced us to confront our own darkest fears and to ask the uncomfortable questions about what we're capable of as human beings. As we close this chapter, it is crucial to remember the names and faces of those who lost their lives at the hands of Gary Ridgway. They were daughters, sisters, and mothers, each with their own stories and dreams. We honor them by remembering. As we conclude this video on the Green River Killer, we're left with a sense of unease and a deeper understanding of the darker side of human nature. But we're also left with a sense of hope, knowing that even in the darkest of times, there are people working tirelessly to bring justice to the victims and their families. What do you think about the Green River Killer case? Do you think Ridgway's punishment fit his crime? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're new here, consider subscribing for more true crime content and in-depth explorations of the most infamous criminals in history. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.